So last week we looked at variation and how they are generated and how mutation acts as a weak evolutionary force. This week we are going to look at perhaps the most important and definitely the most well studied evolutionary force, which is selection. However, before we talk about that, we need to slightly think about one term which we have used already, but we haven't really defined it properly, and that term is trait and its distribution. So what exactly is a trait? So any observable or measurable feature of an organism constitutes a trait. So for example, if you are looking at me, my height, my body size, the fat content of my body, all these are my traits. Now, for evolution to happen, you realize that there has to be variation in the traits, and which essentially means, since we study evolution at the level of the population, that means we need a distribution of the traits, trait distribution as we call it. And the whole point of looking at the effect of selection or microevolution is essentially looking at how this trait distribution is changing. Now, why am I making this point so clearly? The reason is that normally we think of evolution in terms of the entire organism. However, when you are studying evolution, it's very difficult to look at every feature of the organism together. And therefore, one of the things that Darwin did was, since he was coming from his experience in breeding, he put the focus on looking at the trait and its distribution. And therefore, even today when people study evolution, particularly microevolution, they generally talk about a particular trait, or some people talk about 2 or max 3 traits, how those are changing simultaneously. So essentially the focus needs to be slightly altered from looking at the organism as an entirety to looking at the trait, and more importantly, since we are looking at the level of the population, towards looking at the distribution of the traits. Okay. So now that we are done with this, what do we have to say about selection? So remember, we looked at Darwin's logic about natural selection, which said that all organisms produce too many number of offspring. However, the amount of resources that we have is stable, the population sizes are generally stable, which implies that there is going to be competition for the limited amount of resources. On top of this, Darwin made 2 more observations, that A, traits vary within a population, and some of this variation is actually inheritable, which means that it can pass from the parents to the offspring. And based on this, Darwin came to the conclusion that favorable or non-favorable inheritable variation will increase or decrease in frequency over generations. And the process by which this is happening, that is what Darwin called as natural selection. Now, nowadays we think of the same process in slightly different words, which slightly changes the way we emphasize on the concepts. So in today's parlance, one can define selection as the differential reproduction of individuals due to variation in inheritable trait or traits, right? Now, this way of looking at selection straight away tells you that the difference between natural and artificial selection is actually rather, well, quote unquote artificial. So basically, when Darwin was constructing his arguments, he was coming from the perspective of breeding, which obviously was an artificial thing. So, keeping parity with that artificial selection, he made the point that look, a similar process is happening in nature, and therefore he called it as natural selection. However, as far as the details of the process are concerned, they are pretty much the same, whether it is being the selection is being done by nature or by humans, and therefore nowadays many books actually don't even make this distinction, or many a times they say natural selection when they probably mean selection due to, let's say, human activities or something else. So very often people go back and forth between these two topics. Generally, in the context of this course, we are going to use the term selection. However, sometimes when due to historical reasons, we might also end up using the term natural selection. Now, what exactly is natural selection? and why is it that I am called, what exactly do I mean in terms of differential, reproduction, and so on. So let me just break it down to its constituent parts. So in a nutshell, natural selection says that if three conditions are met, then natural selection is definitely going to happen. Now what are those three conditions? A, there has to be a variation in the context of some trait in a group, a breeding group, or populations. Why does it have to be populations? Because remember, evolution, microevolution is always studied at the level of the population across generations. So first condition, trait variation in the population. Second condition, that due to this trait variation, there is a difference in the reproductive output of the individuals. In other words, some individuals produce more babies, some individuals produce less number of babies, and this is due to their having differences in terms of the traits. And finally, if at least part of the observed trait variation is heritable, so if these three conditions are met, then natural selection is going to operate, right? Now what exactly does that mean? Very often that means that the trait distribution will change. It will either the mean will increase or decrease, or the variation will increase or decrease, or some stuff will happen. However, this is the interesting part, that it's not essential that the trait distribution or the properties of the distribution will always change under the effect of selection. There are many situations where actually going from generation to generation the trait distribution is not changing, yet natural selection is operating, which is why we define natural selection in terms of the conditions that need to be met. If these three conditions are met, variation, inheritability, and due to reproductive differential due to the variation, if these three are met, then we say that natural selection is happening. Now if you are thinking about it this way, then there are two major points that you need to observe. Point number one, selection is not evolution. So I am paraphrasing this from a very famous book. Yeah, I think I have this book over here. It is this book. So this is the Genetical Theory of Natural Selection by R.A. Fisher. Actually, this is reputed to be the second most important book in evolutionary biology, next only to Darwin's Origin of Species. And the first sentence of this book is natural selection is not evolution. Now what exactly is meant by that? So selection is one of the many forces that can cause the composition of a population, either in terms of the phenotype or in terms of the allelic distribution, to change. And this change is what we call evolution, right? And therefore natural selection by itself can sometimes lead to evolution, sometimes due to selection evolution will not happen, sometimes evolution will happen but that is not happening due to selection, and so on. And overall the thing to keep in mind is evolution equal to change. Natural selection is one of the ways in which the change can happen, but it is definitely not the only way in which the change can happen. So we have already looked at one force. Remember we said that if there is mutation, then also the allelic distribution, the allelic composition of the population can change, the frequencies can change, and that will qualify as evolution. In the subsequent discussions we are going to look at 2 or 3 more such forces, but this is definitely true that natural selection is one of the very important ones, one of the very strong forces of evolution. The second point, in order to appreciate that, let us see what exactly is happening due to selection. So let us assume that we have 2 genotypes in a population, and let us assume that both of them are in equal proportion. Okay, so 0.5, 0.5 are their frequencies. Now let us assume that one has a growth rate of 1.01, so it is growing at the rate of 1%, the other has a growth rate of 1.02, a very slight difference, second place after decimal in terms of the growth rate. What happens to their distribution? In other words, in what ways does the proportion which starts with 0.5, 0.5, in what ways does that proportion change? And if you do some simulation, very easy simulations, then you will see that the proportion of genotype actually increases even if there is a slight difference in terms of their growth rate. So, in this particular case, you can see that within about 200 generations it goes from about 0.5 to somewhere around 0.9. Now, the point to be noted over here is that in this particular case there is no competition happening. Both the genotypes are surviving during this process, okay. Yet what is happening is that the relative proportions are changing, and because of that evolution is happening. Now, you can see the same thing if you increase the growth rate difference slightly more, let us say 1.01 and 1.1, and you can see very quickly within about 40-50 generations, within about 50-60 generations or so, it goes from the proportion of one type, of genotype 2, which has a higher growth rate, goes from 0.5 all the way to 1. So, the basic point I am trying to make here is that normally when people think about evolution due to natural selection, they are always thinking in terms for struggle for existence or survival of the fittest, right? But that is not really what is happening over here. So, if you think about it, in the first case, the 1.01, 1.02 case, the left panel, both of them are there, they are surviving, okay. They are not competing with each other, or at least the competition is not a necessary condition at all, and yet the relative frequencies are changing, and that frequency is changing because there is a difference in their reproductive output, and therefore selection is happening, evolution due to natural selection is happening, right. So, similarly, there is no concept of survival differential necessarily. So, if you look at it, at the end of 200 generations, both the groups are there, and yet selection has happened, evolution has happened. So, these two conditions, survival of the fittest and struggle for existence, which lots of people think are synonymous to evolution by natural selection, are actually not considered to be necessary conditions for selection anymore. The necessary conditions for selection are the three things that I told you, and competition is just one way in which selection can happen, certainly not the only way. So, given these two features, we are going to talk about many other features of selection as we go forward. What we will do is we will have a quick look at examples of natural selection, and we will look at them from many different areas. So, the first two examples are going to be from nature, and in both these cases I am actually going to lead you towards some videos. So, the first video that you should see is the action of selection on the Galapagos finches. So, this is the HHMI link that I want you to go to and watch that video. There are hundreds of videos available on the internet, many of which are very good, but there is a reason for which I want you to have a look at this one and the next one. So, in this particular case, the reasons are as follows. Number one, this is one of the most famous pieces of work in evolutionary biology in the 21st century, in the 20th and the 21st century. So, this is the work of Princeton biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant. So, they went to the Galapagos Islands and studied the Galapagos finches for 40 years when this video was produced, more than 50 years now, and they made several extremely interesting observations, many of which form the cornerstone of what we understand about evolutionary biology today. So, one of the things, for example, which they are going to tell you in this video is that prior to that everybody thought that evolution, at least in nature, is very, very slow, and yet this was one of those cases where they ended up showing that evolution, measurable microevolution, happens within the space of just 1 year, in one generation in these Galapagos finches. So, although this particular video, the primary question they are asking is in terms of how new species are formed, the reason I want you to have a look at this one and the next one is that they very nicely spell out the conditions which are required for selection, very properly done, and therefore the three conditions that I talked about, you can very easily and nicely experience those conditions for yourself in this video. The second thing is that the above HHMI page not only contains the video, it has some very nice fun activities. I strongly recommend them to you. They won't have anything to do with the evolutions, but they are only for your fun. Thirdly, there is a brilliant book written by Jonathan Weiner called The Beak of the Finch. This won the 1995 Pulitzer Prize for writing, and it's a brilliant read, absolutely superb read, and one of the best non-technical introductions to the work of Peter and Rosemary Grant. Therefore, again, I will recommend this book for anybody, even if you are not trying to become a biologist. For anybody, this book is a nice introduction not only to evolution but to how exactly one can go about doing science. Okay, again, can't be recommended too highly. And finally, although this video is at an introductory level, you have to realize that the work being shown over here is extremely rigorous and extensive, has tons and tons of data, and as I already said, spans over more than 50 years. So, one strong recommendation. The second video that I want you to have a look at is the action of selection on the pocket rock mouse. This is the work of a bunch of people, Michael Nachman, Hopi Hoekstra and others in New Mexico, and again, very nicely shot video, very nicely explained concepts. However, before you head off to the videos, as I said, please remember these three prerequisites for selection that we talked about, the three necessary conditions, and try to see for yourself whether you can identify these things when you are watching the videos. Okay, that is the main reason for which I want you to go there. Now, of course, these are nicely shot, beautifully shot videos, but you don't really need to go off to Galapagos or New Mexico to see good examples of changes due to selection. As a matter of fact, we can see them all around us all the time. So, here are a bunch of examples from breeding and from other human activities. So, for example, most of the crops that we have around us are actually products of some kind of breeding or the other, but one of the major examples of that is evolution of maize. So, the maize or corn is what looks like what we are seeing below in this panel. However, this actually was derived from this relative of wild grass called teosinte, and it was domesticated in New Mexico somewhere about 9,000 to 10,000 years back. And then slowly, by the process of breeding, Mexican farmers ended up bringing it from teosinte all the way to maize. But very interestingly, even today some of the teosinte maize can interbreed, and therefore you can have teosinte maize hybrids, as you see in the middle. You can see it's intermediate between the two forms. Now, this is by no means the only example. Remember, we have already looked at the example of cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, all of them actually being derived from some Brassica family plant within human history. Similarly, one of the major things that we have again and again talked about is antibiotic resistance, arising spread of antibiotic resistance. But the one that really makes it difficult for public health people and for agriculture people is the arising of pest resistance. So, here I am showing you the cumulative number of insect pest species that have evolved resistance to 5 classes of insecticides over the last 50 years or so. So, this data is only up to 1990. We are sure that the total number is way greater than what it was 35 years back. But as you can see, in 1940s the amount of number of resistant pest species was close to 0, whereas in a space of about 50 years this number has risen, the total number has risen to above 500, right. So, this again tells us the relatively fast pace in which these things end up evolving. The other example we already talked about. Remember when we were talking about industrial melanism, and we said that the moment they introduced pollution control laws, the soot deposition level started going down, and when the soot deposition level started going down, the black forms, the so-called melanic forms of the bison betularia, they were no longer being favored and their numbers started decreasing. What I had not done was not shown you the way it decreased, and that is what I am showing you over here. So, on x axis you have 1960 all the way up to 2000. So, 1960s is when those pollution control laws were introduced, and these blue, red and green symbols, they show the relative frequencies of the melanic form, the black form, at 3 different locations in England. And as you can see, within about 10-15 years the frequencies had started falling, and by the time you hit 2000, which is about 30-35 years later, these frequencies have gone actually very close to 0. In other words, things are almost back to normal. The light form has again become the more common form. Now obviously these are pretty spectacular, but if you really want to see spectacular effects of selection, then the best place to see them actually are experimental evolution studies under lab conditions. Many of them are superb, but I am going to give you 2 examples. Both are from India, both are in the field of Drosophila. So, the first example is from the lab of Professor Amitabh Joshi at JNCSR Bengaluru. So, he works on the effect of accelerated development in Drosophila. So, normally Drosophila at about 25 degrees Celsius takes, roughly speaking, about 10 days to develop. But what Professor Joshi's group did was, every generation they selected the top 10% or so flies, the earliest developing flies, and only allowed them to reproduce to the next generation and killed off everybody else. So obviously in order to contribute their gene to the next generation, these flies had to be in the top 10 developers in their population, top 10% developers in their population, and this process continued over some hundreds of generations. Today has led to a reduction of 34% in terms of the development time. In other words, instead of 10 days, they are developing in about 6.3 days. So 34% reduction, just to give you a context. So human beings, our babies, they take about 9 months to develop. So 34% is roughly 1/3. So we are talking about, in the context of human beings, babies coming out in about 6 months development time. Okay. Now of course, the consequences of that and why exactly did they do that and what are the insights that they got from those studies, those are things that we are going to look at in a different study. But the main point over here is, in another study they ended up showing that it looks like these faster developing flies, they are going towards incipient speciation. In other words, the initial stages of separating into different species have actually set in these flies. I will give you one more example. This is from our own lab in Pune. So here what we do is we study the effect of selection for dispersal abilities. So what we do is we take lots of flies in this container, we call it the source container, and here there is no food, there is no moisture, therefore these flies are under a lot of stress. So these flies, they move around when they get stressed out, and very soon they find this hole over here right at the top, and then they decide to, some of them, not all of them, decide to move. The ones that decide to move or disperse, they enter into this pipe that we call the path, and some are able to traverse the entire pipe, some are not. Those are able to traverse the entire pipe, they reach this other container called the destination, and only the flies which reach the destination, only they are allowed to breed for the next generation, everybody else is killed. So this process continues generation after generation, and after every few generations, all we do is we increase the length of the path. In other words, we add a little bit extra length to the path that is connecting the source and the destination. And what has that led to? Well, that has led to many things, but what I want to show you is that when we started our experiment, these flies on an average could move about 4 meters, and therefore we started our experiment with what you are seeing in front of you, a path length of about 2 meters. Okay. Then after a few generations, we had to increase the path length, we were increasing the path length, and the path length became 10 meters, at which point it looked something like this. So, let us see. Yeah. So, this is what a path length of 10 meter looks like, and here are two undergraduates from our institute just for scale, and this is what the entire process looks like. Okay. So, these things that you are seeing, these are the destinations, and let us see if you have a close up. These are the sources from which the flies are starting to migrate, and here. So, this was a path length of 10 meters, and after some time we had to increase the path length even further. Space ran out in the lab. So, that is when this is what we used to do. We used to coil them like Formula 1 racing tracks, and we had to put them in special enclosures like this to ensure uniform lighting. So, this was path length of 20 meters, and then this process continued and continued and continued, and today the path length has become 104 meters. So, we do not have the ability to make a Formula 1 coil that big. So, we have to make multiple layers of coils, and then those coils are stacked on top of each other, which is what you are seeing over here. So, remember, when these guys started, the average distance that the flies could move was 4 meters, and now the path length itself is 104 meters, which is about 26 times of what it started with, 26 times. Okay. Now, why we did all this, what was the result, all those things are different. But the point I am trying to make is that selection can actually lead to massive magnitude of changes in the populations, something that is very difficult to get with any other thing. Okay, there is something called macro mutation that might lead to this, but otherwise in terms of its effect on the population, selection is a very, very strong force. So, how exactly does selection affect variation at the phenotypic and the allelic level? So, that is the question that we are going to discuss in our next discussion. See you till then. Bye.